Let's talk about someone special. A woman born into one of the richest families, but decided to leave it all behind and go against what the world's most loved woman stood for. We're talking about Princess Diana's niece and what she said when she turned 34. She was the niece of Princess Diana, the woman the world could never forget. But while Diana's story was about fighting back and sadness, Kitty Spencer's story was different. A life filled with money, fashion, and careful distance from the tragedy that made her name important. For years, she was known as the daughter of Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, and as the beautiful young woman who smiled in photos when the public wanted her to cry. But now, Lady Kitty Spencer has finally spoken, and what she said proved what many thought all along. Kitty wasn't just another rich person born into scandal. She was raised in the shadow of one of the most photographed women in history. Yet when the world looked to her to carry on Diana's kindness and fighting spirit, Kitty turned towards something else entirely. Control. From the beginning, her family made sure her childhood was nothing like her aunt's. Where Diana was thrown into royal chaos at 19, Kitty was protected behind gates, raised between London and Cape Town. Her mother, Victoria Lockwood, ran away from England to escape the tabloids and pressures. Kitty grew up in South Africa, far from Althorpe House where Diana once played and now rests. When Kitty stepped into the public eye in her 20s, she didn't speak of Diana. She didn't go to royal events. People noticed. How could Diana's niece stay silent while the world still cried for her? Some said she was protecting her family's privacy. Others said she was protecting her image. Fashion magazines called her the new face of British elegance. Dolce & Gabbana made her their muse. But when she appeared in diamond-covered gowns on Italian runways, critics turned harsh. The comparisons to Diana grew colder and meaner. Diana had worn Chanel but cried behind closed doors. Kitty wore fancy clothes and smiled with confidence. And to many, that smile said everything. Everything was revealed at the marriage. In 2021, Kitty married Michael Lewis, a billionaire 32 years older than her. The wedding in Rome looked like a royal crowning. 5 Dolce & Gabbana gowns. No royal family members came. Not even her father, and not Diana's sons, William or Harry. The world called his statement. Kitty called it love. The same tabloids that chased Diana now painted Kitty as someone who betrayed her memory using luxury and distance. But what they didn't see was the quiet war inside her family for decades. Charles Spencer had spent years guarding Diana's memory, publicly criticizing the media and monarchy. Kitty chose to build her own empire, defined by image, not pain. When she finally spoke about Diana, it was slow and quiet. Kitty admitted she felt honored to share her aunt's name, calling Diana the most inspirational woman the world will ever know. But her words lacked closeness. There were no personal stories, no emotional ties. Some said it was dignity. Others said it was distance. Her Instagram showed a life of perfection. No grief, no politics, no comment on Harry and Meghan, just luxury and charity work. While that made her loved in fashion circles, it pushed away people who saw in her the ghost of Diana, a ghost that refused to speak. Close friends remembered how deeply Kitty feared media invasion. She avoided discussions about Diana because of what it did to her father. Reopening that wound meant reliving sadness that had never healed. At 34, something changed. She began to speak of the weight of her family name, the expectations, and the pressure to appear perfect. She admitted she wanted to live life on her own terms. The world already had one Diana, and no one could or should try to be her again. For years, people suspected Kitty's silence wasn't not caring. It was rebellion. A refusal to be used by a system that destroyed her aunt. And when she finally said she never wanted to be compared to Diana again, it wasn't arrogance. It was a basic human right. By the time Kitty walked down that aisle in Rome, her world had split in two. On one side stood the Spencer bloodline and being Diana's niece. On the other stood the life she built, one of glamour and independence. Her father's absence from the wedding wasn't an accident. It was a signal. Charles had positioned himself as the guardian of Diana's memory. But his children, including Kitty, had grown up watching that grief turn into guilt and distance. When Kitty decided to marry Michael Lewis, a man twice her age, it was defiance. A refusal to let the Spencer name decide who she could love or how she should live. Headlines called Kitty the opposite of Diana. They said she traded kindness for image. Every gown she wore became ammunition for those who believed she had abandoned what made the Spencers loved. But critics ignored how Diana herself had warned that her greatest fear was seeing her family consumed by the same fame that killed her. Kitty had grown up knowing that. She'd seen her father haunted by it. She'd seen her mother broken by it. And so she chose a different armor: control, carefulness, and luxury. But not everyone saw it that way. Online debates about her reasons turned bitter. Some argued she was living life on her own terms. Others saw her as a symbol of how privilege protected the Spencers from the kindness Diana once showed. Reddit threads accused her of marrying for money, of deliberately distancing herself from Diana's sons, and of ignoring the humanitarian work that defined her aunt. And yet, behind the noise, there was a pattern most missed completely. Kitty wasn't trying to erase Diana's legacy. She was trying to survive it. When asked why she rarely spoke about her aunt, Kitty said it was something very private and personal to her family. That sentence held a lifetime of sadness she'd never been allowed to process publicly. To speak of Diana meant reopening wounds the family had never fully healed. The silence fed the public's fascination. Every move she made was picked apart for traces of Diana. The tilt of her head, the shape of her eyes, even the way she smiled in photographs, all became symbols of what she represented. When Kitty moved into charity work, she chose her causes carefully. Mental health, children's welfare, women's education. Subtle echoes of Diana's legacy. But she did it privately, almost secretly, without cameras or showy speeches. To her, good work didn't need validation. To the press, that restraint looked like not caring. The marriage widened the gap. Her husband's fortune made him a target. The age gap became a scandal. Some accused her of deliberately crafting a story of distance from the royal circle to avoid the same criticism that destroyed her aunt. Yet the irony was almost poetic. Kitty had become a mirror of the same judgments that once haunted Diana. Only this time, she refused to break under them. Family insiders revealed, but Kitty wasn't chasing validation from her father or the press or the world. For once, she was chasing peace. In her own words, she once said, "I think we're all just trying to find our version of happiness, not someone else's idea of it." For the daughter of a man who lived under constant criticism and the niece of a woman who died because of it, that statement wasn't defiance. It was survival instinct turned philosophy. By her mid-30s, Kitty had mastered the art of distance. Every photo, every statement was deliberate. The girl who once feared the weight of her family name had now learned to use it, to command attention without confession. Behind the perfection were glimpses of someone who inherited her aunt's strength, not her wounds. Because beneath all the diamonds and headlines, Lady Kitty Spencer was still the girl who lost her aunt to a world that couldn't love her gently. And now she was determined not to let it happen again. The more Kitty tried to separate herself from Diana's ghost, the louder it became. Every appearance, every interview avoided, every smile that lingered too long. It all became a point of comparison. The press didn't want Kitty Spencer. They wanted Diana reborn and unbroken. But Kitty refused to play that role. When Meghan Markle entered the royal world, the comparisons multiplied. Meghan's defiance, her friction with the palace, all echoed Diana's final years. The media watched Kitty closely, waiting for a reaction. She gave him nothing. No statements, no sympathy posts. Total silence. And that silence made people suspicious. If Diana's niece couldn't publicly support the woman who seemed to relive her aunt's suffering, what did that say about her loyalty? But that was the point. Kitty had seen what happened when women in her family spoke too much. Diana had spoken and paid for it with her peace, her privacy, her life. Kitty's strategy was the opposite. Control the story by never participating in it. She understood something the public didn't. Being close to royalty was a trap. The more you engaged, the more they consumed you. So while Meghan and Harry's story dominated headlines, Kitty focused on hers. Fashion, charity, and silence. By 2022, debates turned ruthless. Some Reddit users claimed she had completely separated from Diana's legacy out of vanity. Others argued she was protecting herself from the same toxicity that killed her aunt. But both sides agreed on one thing. Lady Kitty Spencer was not what people expected. They expected vulnerability. They got discipline. They expected emotional transparency. They got carefully controlled restraint. And that restraint carried consequences. Her absence from family events, her distance from William and Harry, all became symbolic of the Spencer family's quiet break. Still, the public kept trying to decode her. Every gown, every trip, every photograph with luxury elites was analyzed. The wedding in Rome had cemented her as an international figure of wealth, not kindness. But as time passed, something shifted. The fashion world began to see her not as a model, but as a symbol of composure, strength, and modern aristocracy without the monarchy's chains. For the first time, people began to question whether she had been right all along to keep her distance. Because while Meghan and Harry fought their battles in public, Kitty lived a life untouched by royal scandal. No headlines of feuds, no tabloids picking apart every argument. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that she refused to give the world a weapon. But that silence had a cost. Privately, she struggled with pressure to keep her family name clean while living in an era obsessed with confession. The media demanded vulnerability. Kitty offered discretion. When asked about public life, she said, "Privacy is a luxury, and I intend to keep it." It sounded elegant, but underneath was exhaustion. People in her circle began to notice that Kitty's silence wasn't simply strategy. It was protection from trauma the world refused to let her forget. The image of Diana's death, the paparazzi chase, the endless replays of tragedy. Those were not distant memories to her. They were inherited. Then in 2023, a shift occurred. In a rare interview, Kitty finally acknowledged what the world had guessed for years. She said, "I'm proud of my aunt's legacy, but I've spent my life trying to build my own." It was the first time she openly drew a line between admiration and identity. That one statement took apart decades of guessing. For the first time, she didn't sound offensive. She sounded certain. What most people missed was how calculated that confession was. It didn't come from pressure or guilt. It came from clarity. Kitty had reached the point where she no longer needed to prove that distance from Diana didn't mean disloyalty. It meant survival. When Lady Kitty Spencer finally spoke, it wasn't through a magazine cover or palace interview. It wasn't planned or rehearsed. It came quietly during a talk about legacy, love, and the burden of public memory. And in that moment, she confirmed what many had whispered for years, that her silence wasn't arrogance. It was armor. She said, "For most of my life, I've watched what fame did to people I loved. I promised myself I'd never let that happen to me." It was the closest she'd ever come to admitting the truth. That being Diana's niece wasn't a privilege. It was a warning. For years, Kitty had walked through life carrying a name that didn't belong entirely to her. Every magazine headline, every introduction, every mention of Diana's niece reminded her that she wasn't seen as herself. She was an echo of someone else's tragedy. And for the longest time, she thought distance would protect her from it. But now at 34, she understood that silence doesn't erase history. It only reshapes it. Her confession wasn't a scandal. It was acknowledgement that she loved Diana, admired her deeply, but couldn't live in her shadow any longer. "We don't honor the people we lose by copying them," she said. "We honor them by surviving differently." Those words hit harder than any royal revelation because they spoke to the truth of what every Spencer had been fighting privately for decades. The right to live beyond Diana's story. What most people didn't realize was that her journey toward peace began years before that statement. Behind the scenes, Kitty had reconnected quietly with her mother, Victoria Lockwood, who had long battled mental health struggles after running away from the toxic pressures of aristocratic life. Their bond became Kitty's anchor, a reminder that healing wasn't always public and that sometimes walking away from the spotlight is the bravest thing a woman can do. It was Victoria, not the crown, who taught her that silence could be strength. That private happiness mattered more than public approval. Those lessons shaped the woman Kitty became. She no longer tried to fit the story of royal tragedy or fairy tale success. She began to live in the middle, where truth usually hides. The glamour remained, but so did perspective. She shifted her focus toward charity work, mentorship, and the kind of giving back that didn't make headlines. Her projects in child welfare and education grew quietly, mirroring Diana's compassion, but not her exposure. In the months after her confession, her interviews carried a different tone. There was less caution, more sincerity. She spoke about identity, about how people mistake privilege for protection, and about how fame doesn't change grief, it only makes it bigger. And when asked again about Diana, she said something that silenced even her harshest critics. She wasn't a myth to me. She was my aunt. I just wish the world had loved her the way they said they did before it was too late. It was the first time she allowed emotion to surface. For years, people assumed Kitty had erased Diana from her story. But the truth was far more painful. She hadn't spoken because every conversation about Diana was a reminder of how cruel the world can be to women who refuse to conform. To talk about her aunt meant reliving the same cruelty that shaped her childhood.